Ladies and gentlemen, this is the C.D. Howe Institute's Directors' Dinner. The C.D. Howe Institute's Directors' Dinner follows directly after the meetings of the C.D. Howe Institute's previous board, its annual meeting of members, and a meeting of its new board. One thing that is common to all of these events is that the chair of the C.D. Howe Institute's board, Hugh McKinnon, runs them with military precision exactly to time. And that is a tradition that is very nice to honor as we get to the C.D. Howe Institute's Directors' Dinner. I was just saying, everyone, that it was the day of the Institute's board meetings, the annual meeting of our members, and the election of the new board of the C.D. Howe Institute. I will just about that say that it is tremendous to have such a strong group of supporters for a think tank that is nonpartisan, not usually polemical. Occasionally I slip a little. But has a pretty high standard, if you don't mind my advertising it, for fact-based analysis and logic. We try to contribute to public policy debates as best we can with that kind of a background. And as I say, it's marvelous to have the board members and the members, the supporters of the Institute who support that mission and are ready to hear us tell it like we think it is, even if they don't necessarily agree with everything we put out. That just goes with the territory. So I'm going to give everyone a round of applause, thanking you for your support. Please join in if you're so minded. Before I get off the podium, I do want to say one thing about the substance of tonight's dinner, for which we are so glad to have Kelly Craft, David MacNaughton, and Gary Doer to lead the discussion. The roots of the C.D. Howe Institute are in Canada-U.S. relations. They go all the way back to the late 1950s, earlier than even I can remember. When there was a group of business, labor leaders, various professionals who got together to try and provide a channel for communication across the border to deal with the various trade frictions, investment frictions, other troubling problems with Canada-U.S. relations that existed at the time. And the roots of the organization are in that period. It's gone through a number of twists and turns and developments to become the freestanding think tank that it is now. But Canada-U.S. trade and economic relations have always been core to the Institute's mandate. And although we might wish that we were discussing slightly less challenging circumstances, tonight's dinner is entirely in keeping with that tradition, and we're very much looking forward to the comments and the discussion from our former ambassadors and then from the room as a whole. I have one announcement to make, though, before we get started and before I invite you to enjoy your dinners. Many of you will have seen an announcement earlier today that my colleague, Institute President Duncan Munn, is retiring from the C.D. Howe at the end of this month. He has been a tremendous contributor to the C.D. Howe Institute since 2020. We've worked together side by side since I became CEO in 2006. His energy, his commitment to the mission, his development of the human capital of the organization, his stewardship of its finances. I really can't say enough about what Duncan has done for the Institute. I'm very pleased that he'll be staying associated to us as a senior advisor through the end of the year. I'm also pleased to say that we're going to be having an annual roundtable on a topic of interest to Duncan, which is a pretty broad canvas to be working on. Duncan, I don't see you in front of me right now. There you are. Everyone, please join me in thanking Duncan for great service to the Institute. Well, that was a very well-deserved ovation. And Duncan, it's a pleasure to wish you success in your future endeavors, because it's always nice to make wishes you know will come true. Thank you, Duncan. I must interrupt your dinners to bring us to the business part of the meeting. From the sound of the room, everyone has enjoyed the company at their tables, and I expect that a topic of conversation at many tables has been Canada-US relations, the road ahead, as you all get warmed up for the main event, which I promise will be equally enjoyable. Not all of it's intended to be enjoyable. I should warn in advance, there will be parts where you might be gritting your teeth, but in a good way, because we're going to get a lot of insight into what it may happen over the coming months and years. And I know everyone, I'll speak with some confidence for the room in saying, thinking about how Canada should navigate this, and whether Canada can see a path forward but then actually follow it, which sometimes is a difficulty in public life, as we all know. That's on everyone's minds. I do have a few notes in front of me, and they're prepared by the CD Howe Institute's events team. They did not suggest that I should mention them, but I'm going to do it now. We love our events program at the CD Howe Institute. It's enjoyable in its own right. We love the convening, we love the conversation that goes on, and we love the stimulation that it gives to the research program. I'll ask you for a round of applause for the CD Howe Institute events team. Events team, please wave your hands in the air. It's tempting to say a lot more about the director's dinner. The key point to make is that the CD Howe Institute does get a lot of support from the business community. Many companies are members of the Institute, many are members of its policy councils, and then many people from the business community are individual members as well. We very much appreciate the support that everyone gives to the type of work that the CD Howe Institute does. About this dinner, which is held in honor of our supporters from the business community, I'll mention Michael Wilson, former Minister of Finance, because he was also an ambassador to the United States, much missed. John Manley and Bill Morneau have appeared here. We've had provincial premiers who were serving in office. Of course, we have a former premier with us tonight in Gary Doer. We had Kathleen Wynne. We've had business leaders such as Victor Dodig, Roy Gorey, and Marcia Moffat, who is here with us tonight. And last year's speaker was Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem. So it's a big event in the CD Howe Institute's in its annual event calendar. And we're very pleased to acknowledge the support of Bennett Jones and Johnson & Johnson for tonight's event. If you have enjoyed the company at your table, if you have enjoyed your food, and if you enjoy, as you will, the discussion to come, please join me in thanking Bennett Jones and Johnson & Johnson for their support. I think the one other thing I should say just before getting the show on the road is that this event is on the record. Many of you attend CD Howe Institute events regularly, and you know we often do them off the record, but given the salience of the topic and the keen interest from people outside this room, we thought we should do this one on the record. So govern yourselves accordingly when we get to the discussion, knowing that you might be quoted even without your permission, which is an unusual thing for us. To introduce our speakers formally, I'm delighted to ask to come to the stage Dominic Hussey, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Bennett Jones and the co-head of their innovation, technology, and branding practice. I don't know how much contact she and James Brody from J&J may have had, but given their roles in innovation and technology and so on, I imagine they have crossed paths, I presume in an amicable way and not on opposite. I would not want to be opposite Dom in the courtroom. But in any event, Dom, it's terrific to have you here. Thank you very much. And please come to the front of the room to welcome our speakers.
Thank you very much, Bill. And good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here tonight and joined by 11 of my Bennett Jones colleagues. Our firm is proud to be a longstanding sponsor of the C.D. Howe Institute and its important work. Many of our members are actively involved. Bill mentioned some, and most significantly, our Chair Emeritus and Chair of the Board of Directors of the Howe, Hugh McKinnon. We refer to Bennett Jones as being the firm that businesses trust with their most complex legal matters, and our clients' issues are multifaceted and multidisciplinary. Our aim is to simplify the complexity and to solve problems, and that cannot be done without careful consideration of what here is being called the road ahead. The political and economic environment inevitably affects our clients' rights and realities in ways that we need to understand in order to deliver excellent service. So our lawyers and public policy advisors are not just interested in, but are directly attuned to and engaged in these issues in an academic sense and in a practical sense. No issue of international affairs is more significant to Canada and its businesses than our relationship with the US. So for us, as for others in this room, tonight's Director's Dinner is a unique opportunity to explore some of the major issues affecting Canadian business and policy. And we are immensely privileged to be hearing from our three speakers tonight, who will provide a behind-the-curtains perspective of Canada-US relations. For a decade, our speakers were at the center of the action. Their combined time as ambassadors spanned 2 presidents and 2 prime ministers. They were deeply involved in our foreign policy, responding to shifts in the energy sector, major infrastructure projects, and negotiating momentous trade deals. They handled their files deftly and contributed their own legacies to the esteemed history of diplomatic excellence in Canada-US relations. Their appointments as ambassadors underscored the importance of the partnership between our 2 countries. Kelly Craft has served as U.S. Ambassador to Canada and U.S. Ambassador to the UN. In the former position, Ambassador Craft distinguished herself through her work in the successful renegotiation of NAFTA, in which her role was praised as instrumental, integral, and extraordinary. Through it all, Ambassador Craft maintained good relations between Ottawa and Washington, and is highly respected for having influence in the White House and for listening to the concerns of Canadian officials and businesses. Ambassador Craft is a 3rd-generation Kentuckian and a leader, entrepreneur, and philanthropist who has made community service and improving education the cornerstone of her career. Gary Doer served as Canada's ambassador to the United States, before which he was the Premier of Manitoba, leading his party to 3 consecutive majority governments. As Premier, he led strategic investments in healthcare, education, and infrastructure, and worked with US and Mexico governors to improve trade and cooperation. As ambassador, he worked with leaders in Canada and the US to secure Canada's entry into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He also helped to negotiate a presidential permit for the now almost complete construction of the Gordie Howe Bridge between Windsor and Detroit. The gap, yes. So the gap of mere meters between the 2 countries should be closed this summer, and you can draw whatever analogies you will from that. Ambassador Doer is also renowned for his work in renewable energy, regulatory reform, light vehicle emission standards, and improving the flow of trade and travel between Canada and the US. David MacNaughton succeeded Gary Doer as Canadian ambassador to the US. He has a long record of public service at the federal and provincial levels. His experience and impact on public affairs and government relations in Canada is renowned. He has been president of Canada's largest government and public relations firm, and after that, North American president of the world's largest PR firm. He is currently president of Palantir Canada, a data integration and analytics software giant. Ambassadors MacNaughton and Craft worked together closely and effectively in the USMCA negotiations, or as we call the agreement in Canada, CUSMA. And after the deal was signed, they publicly spoke together about the benefits and the strength of US-Canadian ties, a wonderful testament to a relationship of respect and cooperation. Now to the road ahead. What does it look like for Canada and the United States? Whether it is smooth or a bit bumpy, the two countries will find themselves on adjacent paths. And as Ambassador Croft said about the US and Canada, our relationship is not a marriage because marriage can end in divorce. This is a family, said the ambassador, and family is forever. And I would add, as also happens in families, when one member sneezes, the other catches a cold. And with that, over to you, our speakers. Thank you, ambassadors, and to moderator Bill Robson, who needs no introduction. Thank you.
Got a little prop here, so excuse me. Good evening. How is everyone? Good. Thank you all for having me. This feels like I'm coming back home, so thank you very much. Joe and I absolutely loved our time in this beautiful country. I'll have to pause a minute and introduce my husband, Joe Kraft. So it's nice to have my husband with me today. If I had one regret, it's that I didn't have an opportunity to travel up to the far north. It is such an important and very strategic part of the world. I ran through Vancouver, I rode horses at the Calvary Stampede, and I kissed the cod in Newfoundland. And I visited every province in between. Even though my favorite player, Pascal Siakam, is no longer a Raptor. You now have our Kentucky player, Quickly, who I'll be wearing his jersey. So if you don't know him, you need to get to know him. He is a great young man. So congratulations. And I fell in love with this country. So I may have come from away, but I feel like tonight I've come home. My experience has shown that Canadians in particular, have a gift for friendship, and I am grateful for that gift because it was so abundantly bestowed on me during my service here. I departed Ottawa to represent the United States at the United Nations. In the hard world of international relations, it's sometimes said that diplomats never make friends, just allies of the moment or vanishing acquaintances. Well, I can tell you, maybe that's true, but it's not true here. And that is something I can tell you because of David MacNaughton and myself and this relationship that we've had since I left Canada. So since leaving the UN, I've traveled across the world, Tokyo to Taipei, Tel Aviv, Kyiv, from Gaza, Israel, the border, US and Mexico border. Some of those are really tough neighborhoods. And I've seen up close what all of us can see on our television screens. The world is on fire, and it underscores more than ever why this neighborhood is vital. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the state of the world and Canada's role in it, and what the future holds for a US-Canada partnership. I come as a friend who cares deeply about this country and our relationship. Many of you, actually most of the world, are wondering if Donald Trump is going to return to the White House. Well, I believe he is, and here's why. No president in my lifetime has unleashed as many calamities at once as Joe Biden. On his watch, Americans have experienced the worst inflation in 40 years, the worst crime wave since the 90s, and the worst border crisis in American history. Abroad, the enemies who attacked us on 9/11 took back the safe haven from which they planned those horrific attacks. And expansionist Russia has invaded its neighbors. Americans are being held hostage again overseas. Iran and its proxies are attacking our ally, Israel, and firing hundreds of missiles at US forces in Iraq, Syria, and the Red Sea. According to the 538 average of polls, he is the single most unpopular president since the end of World War II. He faces double-digit disapproval on every issue, 86%, say he is too old for another term. So I come to you with a simple message this evening. You better buckle up and get ready, because Trump is coming back. What is that going to mean for U.S.-Canada relations? Well, when it comes to trade, it's really good. I spent months at the negotiating table alongside Robert Lighthizer and right across from Ambassador MacNaughton, hammering out the details of USMCA. It was a hard slog, but we got it done. It was one of the great achievements of the Trump presidency. President Trump had a vested interest in making that agreement a success. Under his presidency, America First was not a slogan, but a statement of the first duty of all Americans in political power. USMCA is working. U.S. exports to Mexico and Canada are up 45% since 2020. The flood of auto manufacturing jobs leaving the United States from Mexico has stopped. The new rules of origin has already directed and created thousands of new American jobs in manufacturing, auto parts, and vehicles. New battery plants are being built in the U.S., including in my home state of Kentucky. Even Nancy Pelosi, who you all know is no fan of Trump, has said there is no question this trade agreement is much better than NAFTA. One of the ways this agreement was improved over NAFTA was that it included a joint review to take place on the 6th anniversary of entry into force of USMCA, which will be July 1, 2026. We put that clause in because we wanted to prevent ourselves from ever finding us saddled with an unbalanced, outdated agreement with no leverage to change it other than the threat of immediate withdrawal. The review process will give President Trump the ability to address those issues that have emerged since the agreement came into effect. If the parties work out the issues raised, then the agreement will be extended for another 16 years. But if President Trump is not satisfied with the changes and no agreement is reached, then USMCA will automatically end 10 years after the review. President Trump, as you all know, loves business negotiations. So I wouldn't be surprised if he did not use those skills to address such issues as creating new tools to stop the importation of Chinese goods through Mexico, reversing the decision by USMCA dispute panel that ruled in favor of Canada and Mexico against the US to allow more auto parts of Chinese origin to find its way into cars in the North America market. I'm not sure why Canada and Mexico wanted to allow Chinese workers to make those parts instead of the US, but the Trump administration will make sure that those jobs go to workers in North America. I expect that the issues Trump raises will be resolvable, and that the success of this review process in resolving disputes will show the world why USMCA is far superior to NAFTA. So that's why I think a second Trump administration will be positive news for trade. And when it comes to foreign policy, the news is even better. Because under the President Trump, the US is not going to be projecting weakness. He was the toughest president since Ronald Reagan on Russia. He raised US defense spending to near historic highs. He made America an energy superpower again. He eliminated the Islamic State's physical caliphate. And he drew a red line with Iran's leaders, warning that if they or their terrorist proxies killed a single American, Iran would pay a price. And when Iran did cross that red line, he took out Iran's terrorist mastermind, Soleimani. He recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and he brokered not one, not two, but 3 Arab-Israeli peace accords. A diplomatic achievement that would have earned anyone else the Nobel Peace Prize. He is the only president in the 21st century on whose watch Russia did not invade one of its neighbors. And he is the only president since Ronald Reagan on whose watch America was not dragged into a new war. He didn't retreat behind a fortress America. He made our enemies retreat. And I am confident that President Trump will do the same in a second term. But he's going to expect some things from our allies. Canada is one of the wealthiest countries in the NATO alliance. Yet it's 6th from the bottom terms of defense spending. In the 2014 NATO summit, Canada agreed that all allies must spend a minimum of 2% of GDP on defense. Back then, Canada's defense spending had fallen to just 1% of GDP. Well, here we are a decade later, and Canada is just spending just 1.38% of GDP on defense. The only NATO allies who spend less on defense are Slovenia, Turkey, Spain, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Canada has just reaffirmed its commitment to that 2% minimum last year. Canada has committed to increase its defense spending by just 1.7% by 2030. You know what, I'm sorry, but Albania and Bulgaria managed to spend 1.8%, and that's just not going to fly under a Trump administration. Defense Minister Blair recently said that we must uphold the global rules that underpin our prosperity and sovereignty. He's right, but you can't say you support the global rules-based order if you're willing to pull your weight. Since Russia's invasion, the United States has provided Ukraine with $175 billion in support. Canada has committed just $13.3 billion. I say this as a friend to both Canada and Ukraine. That's not good enough. Keep in mind that this spending, 90% of the aid that has gone to Ukraine from America has gone to create jobs in the States, create jobs in the manufacturing areas of munitions, of weapons. And I can tell you that President Trump is not going to allow the American people to carry the lion's share of the burden while our allies don't pull their weight. The bottom line is Canada needs to step up. Canada needs to spend more on its own defense and more to help Ukraine. Ukraine aid can provide a direct cash infusion into factories across this country that directly benefits Canadian workers. The specific goals to accelerate the establishment of new artillery ammunition productivity in Canada and a reliable Canadian supply of NATO standard ammunition. Canada can advance these goals by providing more military aid for Ukraine. Our aid is not only increasing our defense production capacity, it's modernizing the US military. Canada can do the same. Let me close by saying this. I know this is a tough message. And actually, since it's not closed, I didn't say a lot. So thank you for saying that. And we'll say more during questions. But I'm delivering this as a friend who loves this country and a friend who wants the US-Canada relationship to prosper. Canada and the US have shared in the adventures of the world. The beaches of Europe are the highest memorial of our continuous effort to maintain democracy. We have joined in a multitude of endeavors over the year. The example of goodwill, cooperation, and mutual respect between our respective countries has existed almost from the beginnings of both. That could be a beacon to this now troubled world. As U.S. Ambassador, I wasn't just your ally. You embraced Joe and me as family. And so I'm here to return that kindness by sharing with you the truth, the best advice that I have for navigating a Trump presidency. And I believe if Canada does its part, the second Trump term will usher in the greatest era of U.S.-Canada relations. I would like to close with a toast from President Ronald Reagan to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney at the state dinner, April 27, 1988. The essence and the strength of the relations between our two countries are people. Our people naturally get along well together. We share our triumphs, our victories, as we share our adversities. And at times, when we spar, we do so without rancor, and we work out our differences. May this very special and productive spirit of cooperation remain in place. And as John Diefenbaker so ably put it, our peoples are North Americans. We are the products of the same hope, faith, and dreams. Here is to the Canada-U.S. relationship. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I toned it down just a tad.
Your words carried a lot of weight. Thank you very much. That was excellent. I believe Gary Doer is next. Gary, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, ambassadors. I don't have any hockey sweaters or basketball sweaters. I'm just a poor guy from Western Canada trying to make a living, going up and down my wing, trying to put the puck in the net. So, but I know how popular this player is with the Raptors because Ambassador MacNaughton told me that. One of the things that's great about Canada-U.S. relations, if you're an ambassador, is you get to meet and work with a fellow ambassador on the other side. And I think it's been very advantageous for both Canada and the United States to have Ambassador MacNaughton, Ambassador Kraft working together at that critical time. I had the privilege of working with Ambassador Jacobson. Somebody thankfully mentioned the Gordie Howe Bridge. Gordie Howe's from Saskatoon, if anybody wants to buy a Detroit Red Wings sweater. And of course, we had the privilege of working together on that bridge, and the Minister of Transportation who led our efforts, John Baird, is here tonight. So thank you very much for your leadership. Now, one of the things you do as ambassador is part of what you do is advocate morning, noon, and night on behalf of your own country. It's a terrible job. You've got to drink for your country, going out there every day on that diplomatic circuit in Washington. But the other part of your job is to say to your own home team, that dog won't hunt. That proposal we think is so great, not going to fly. It's not going to fly with the White House, it's not going to fly with the Senate, it's not going to fly with the Congress. And then they'll take another run at it. It's not, that dog's still not going to hunt. You know, so part of what you do as an ambassador is a twofold relationship on what can work, what can get done, what can't get done, and what's impossible to get done. My first week I was in Washington, I had the privilege of being invited to a meeting hosted by General Petraeus, who was in charge of Southcom. And it was a meeting of all the ambassadors that were representing countries that had troops in Afghanistan. And General Petraeus came up and introduced himself to me because I was the rookie, the new guy in town in Washington. He said, you know, this is going to be an interesting discussion, really interested in your views. I just want you to know that there's a lot of ambassadors that are going to be here today that are representing militaries that are in the Club Med section of Afghanistan. And Canada is in the toughest, most complicated part of the whole country in Kandahar. And they are the most skilled military as part of the Canadian and US allies in that regime. They're taking on the most injuries per capita, the most bravery, the most skill. And so I always took that with me as a point of pride about Canada. And one thing I did learn early on from General Petraeus is that, you know, we're friends, we're neighbors, we're allies, but the relationship our military and the US military has each day together on protecting innocent citizens in North America and in our neighborhood and around the world is really, really valuable. And so a couple of months later, I got a call that we would be sending CF-18s to Libya. And in fact, they wanted a Canadian general to be in charge to pas français with some of the French forces to make sure we had a coordinated effort between Canada, the United States, France, the UK, dealing with the Gaddafi regime. So again, I was very proud. You know, what's the difference between being an ambassador and a premier? If you're a premier, you're sending water bombers to Montana. If you're an ambassador, you're sending CF-18s to Libya. There is a little bit of a difference in terms of its importance for the world and for our community. So I want to talk a little bit about what Ambassador Kraft talked about, that we have a very important relationship with the United States, and I believe very strongly that we have to meet our 2% NATO commitment. Very, very strongly. And we should not take for granted, we should not take for granted for one moment our relationship. We should not take for granted at all that we cannot participate in the way that we agreed. Now, I was in, I read that letter from the senators just recently. Most of these senators that signed that letter, they're friends of Canada. They're good, honorable people from both political parties that we should pay attention to. And just last year, I was invited to speak in Boise, Colorado, to the Penwar Group, elected US and Canadian politicians from either side of the border in Western United States and Western Canada. And I have never been asked more difficult questions over and over and over again about an article in the Wall Street Journal that said that Canada signed on, but Canada had no intention of meeting the 2% target. Now, the first time I heard the term, I heard it in a healthcare debate with the federal government when I was a premier. When the check came, you went to the bathroom. But then I heard it again by other political leaders in Canada talking about this issue. So I believe we can still be strong allies, but I do not want us to pass the 2% because somebody tells us to do it. It's agreeing to the 2% because it's the right thing to do. And I strongly believe that, and it's most important that we do it before that Washington NATO meeting. It's most important we do it because I think Canada supports that. Canada believes in protecting the sovereignty of our country. They believe in protecting the sovereignty of our Arctic, and they therefore believe in investing in defense in our neighborhood of North America. So I strongly urge the federal government to get onto the 2%. I think we're at 1.78 or 1.68. Like, this is not, complicated. Take some of my capital gains tax on my cottage. Dare I say that? And put it into the military, for God's sake. It's not that complicated. On trade, I just want to say I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago. I know that some of the issues are going to be really difficult. I want to be blunt. The election in Mexico a couple of days ago continues the regime that was just elected and our folks dealt with a couple of years ago. The biggest issue of trade I hear from senators, from chambers of commerce, from trade organizations, from the Trade Department of the US, with friends of mine that I trust, is the fact that Mexico, unfortunately, is using the trade agreement to support state-owned enterprises from China, basically coming in from behind the trade agreement in our neighborhood of North America. I thought Canada did a good job supporting the United States on the energy disagreement on trade. I'm glad we did that. I'm glad our Washington ambassador was strong on that issue. But I think we should get out in front of that really early. We should be, United States and Canada should be united, that there's no backdoor to our neighborhood that undermines all the principles of the democratic trade that we have between our two countries. I just want to spend 1 minute on getting the 1 minute sign. What's going to happen in the next US election? Well, there's 7 swing states that nobody in this room knows how it's going to go. But they're all neighbors of Canada. All neighbors of Canada. The Great Lakes states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Pennsylvania, I'm going to miss a state, Ohio, and Indiana. It has a little sliver of land there, where actually oil comes from Canada through their pipeline. So I think it's going to be very, very important. But the media narrative is there's going to be, at minimum, the Democrats are going to take the House and That's the hook, Harry. I got the hook. So give him the hook. So the Democrats are going to win the House, and the Republicans are going to win the Senate. And they're treating that like a swap. Swap the House, swap the Senate. Everybody in this room knows it's involved in trade. The Senate has 10, 20, 30 times more power than the House. They appoint the ambassadors, they appoint the cabinet administration, they appoint the military leadership, they appoint the Supreme Court. It's really, really important. So I think we have to really understand as Canadians dealing with trade how important that shift is going to be. The Senate's going to become way more important for Canada. It always has been important. Those 23 people signing that letter is important, and we should pay a lot of attention to that. I know the term has been used. I don't know whether Perrin Beatty's here tonight, charm offensive, but the only thing that matters in Canada-U.S. relations is in enlightened self-interest between our two countries. When Sonny Perdue, who hosted a premier's group in Georgia, a few years later was the Trump Agriculture Secretary, he was totally aware that Canada was the United States' biggest agricultural customer. Being good customers is more important than any other speech you can ever make on trade between our two countries. So we have to continue to inform on the basis of our mutual self-interest, trade, energy, etc. And we have to step up to the plate before the July meeting in NATO and get to 2%. That's the Canadian way. That's what should be the resolution from this convention. Thank you very, very much.
Gary, that was terrific. My terrible noise there was intended to emphasize a point, and I'm sorry that it distracted from it. We do need a more robust revenue base for our defense spending than capital gains taxes, but we'll solve that problem when we get to the 2%. David, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, and it is delightful to see Kelly and Joe Kraft. We really did spend an awful lot of time together in some rather challenging circumstances, but it all worked out well, and without a doubt, it would not have happened without Kelly Kraft's great support and advice and, counsel during the whole process. So thank you very much for everything you did. It wasn't always easy, I don't think, as I recall it. Anyway, I'll talk a little bit about the military stuff. I just simply want to say that what Kelly and Gary have said about meeting our commitments is extraordinarily important. And I think, too many people don't really appreciate how important it is, but it doesn't take you very long to be down in Washington to understand the importance that the Americans have about us being partners. I'm just going to tell a few stories. I'm not going to tell some stories because I really can't tell some of those stories. But, for starters, I was born here in Canada, family's all here, but my grandfather on my father's side was actually an American. And he was one of 30,000 Americans who came to Canada between 1914 and 1917 to fight with the Canadian troops before the US got into the war. And he met a woman overseas and ended up marrying her and staying in Canada. But, I had no appreciation. I knew my grandfather had been American. I knew I'd seen pictures with a military uniform on, but I had not realized that statistic and that kind of relationship between Canada and the United States until I went to Washington. And I found out from our military and the US military about the stories of Americans coming to Canada to fight overseas between 14 and 17. I presented my credentials under President Obama the week before Prime Minister Trudeau went to Washington for a state visit. And at the time, everybody was talking about the bromance between Trudeau and Obama and, how great it was going to be and everything else. And I'm thinking to myself, this is going to be easy. This is going to be like shooting fish in a barrel. I think what I'm going to do is I'll just take on that softwood lumber problem because hell with the bromance that's going on, not going to take much for me to solve that problem. And I had 2 or 3 meetings with the U.S. trade representative, and I wasn't making a heck of a lot of progress. And finally, he said to me, I like you, and I know what you're trying to do and everything else, but I'm going to tell you, we're not going to do a deal on softwood lumber. And I said, why not? He said, well, because the president's priority is to get TPP agreed to. And to get it through Congress, there are 2 or 3 senators that he needs to have on side, and 2 of them don't want to have any kind of a deal on softwood lumber. So it's not going to happen. And all of a sudden, I realized that, well, it was really important to me, and the relationship between the president and the prime minister was great. There were other factors at play that I hadn't really appreciated. And it was a really good thing to have happen to me early on, because it sort of, started making me think a little bit about, okay, well, what are they facing? What kind of challenges do they have? And unfortunately, what had happened before I actually realized, the difficulty of getting the softwood deal done, I'd set up a dinner with Senator Wyden from Oregon, who was one of the senators that Obama wanted to have on side in order to get the TPP done, and was also one of the people who didn't want to have a softwood lumber agreement. And so anyway, I thought, well, I might as well go ahead and have dinner with the senator. I mean, you don't get too many chances to do that. So we sit down for dinner, and he says, I know what you want to talk about. You want to talk about softwood lumber. Well, there's no damn way I'm going to do anything on softwood lumber. It's not happening. I said, Senator, actually, I knew that. I didn't come to talk about that. He said, what do you want to talk about? I said, well, I understand that there's a lot of Oregon wine that's going into British Columbia, and it's causing a lot of British Columbians to get headaches. And the more Oregon wine they drink, the worse their headaches get. And I'm thinking about getting Health Canada to actually ban Oregon wine from going into Canada. He said, you wouldn't do that. And I said, well, I certainly would. I'm not sure our government would, but anyway. But it was a fascinating experience, since I've been back, since I left Washington after we got the deal done, after we got the steel and aluminum tariffs off, I've continued to keep in touch with a lot of people that I met during that time, and at one point, I was talking to somebody about critical minerals, and I thought, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to phone a friend who had a very senior job in the administration, in the Trump administration, and I'm going to try and find out why it is that the United States isn't buying critical minerals from Canada, isn't doing what they essentially did that created an aluminum industry in this country by agreeing to take or pay contracts to buy Canadian aluminum. And it really was the thing that launched, that industry in this country. And so I phoned and I said, why aren't you doing some kind of a take or pay on our critical minerals? And he said, David, look, we'd love to get your critical minerals, but we'd like to have them before 2050, which is probably around maybe by the time you get them out of the ground. And I think, sometimes we don't realize that we have put in place so many, boxes to check and rules and everything else, and each of them is probably, important in its own way, but we can't get out of our way sometimes to actually do things that are a priority, which would, earn income for Canada, but also, do a lot for our partnership and our relationship. And I was out in British Columbia last summer for LNG conference that was originally supposed to be held in St. Petersburg, not Florida, the other one, but got moved because of the Russians' invasion of Ukraine. And there were people from, 50 different countries. We had 15 indigenous chiefs, all of whom were, interested in what Canada could do to help reduce, global emissions by doing, whether it was with Germany, whether it was with Japan, whether it was China, whatever, exporting our natural gas. And we had all these people that were interested. We had lots of indigenous support for it. The senior person from the government of Canada was an assistant deputy minister. Not one single cabinet minister showed up to support that. And I'm not a climate denier or anything like that, but we have resources in this country that can earn income, can help in terms of energy security. When President Biden said no to the KXL pipeline, and I confess I'm on the board of TC Energy, so I declare that right up. And he did it under the guise of being an environmental thing, and within 3 months was over trying to beg Saudi Arabia and Iran to increase oil and gas production because the cost of gas in the United States was going up. Anyway, I see the next few years in Canada-US relationships as being very pivotal. As Kelly has said, the review mechanism was something that we agreed to. It wasn't a sunset clause. It doesn't automatically terminate. But one of the flaws in the previous agreement was you didn't have any ability to review things that might be out of date or where there was misunderstandings or whatever it is. And I think this review mechanism is good. I think that we can find a way to, regardless of whether it's President Trump or whether it's President Biden, that we can find a way to deal with some of the issues that have arisen that both sides want to, or all three sides want to have dealt with. So I'm reasonably optimistic. I do want to say one other thing, which is that, one of the key reasons that we got the deal done that we did was the degree of collaboration that we had with all of the premiers in the country, with the business community and with labor. I traveled right across the country. I met with every premier. I met with lots of the cabinets. We had a degree of collaboration that was, I think unprecedented. I used to call, premiers and say, can you help and go to South Dakota or go to, Nevada or whatever for this event to show how important Canada is to the U.S. No one ever said no. We had a degree of, support from the business community. We didn't always agree on everything, but everybody stuck together and worked hard to support the initiative. And the same thing in the United States. I mean, we had U.S. business collaborating with our business people to show how important the relationship was. And I think, at the present moment, politics has become really nasty, and the degree of collaboration between politicians and the business community is, I think, deteriorated, and it's really, I think, it's not a good thing. We have a country which is, got just shy of 40 million population. We can't afford to have provinces bickering with the federal government, bickering with each other, and the business community bickering with governments, whether they be provincial or federal. And so I think one of the key roles that the C.D. Howe Institute plays, and I take my hat off to the staff and to all of you who supported it, is to help foster a better relationship between business and government. And so thank you all for that. I found my time in Washington to be as difficult a job as I'd ever had or probably ever will have. It was 24/7. I never knew what the president was going to say or do at any point. And yet it was enormously satisfying and rewarding. It was a privilege to serve our country. And I really, the number of times that people would randomly, when I was going through airports, would come up to me and say, thank you for your service, just made it all worthwhile, and something that kept me going throughout a really difficult time. That and a fantastic relationship with the U.S. ambassador who, we used to, she did a good job of representing her country, and I think I did a good job of representing ours, but we also worked hard to find common ground where we could actually make a difference. So thank you all. Happy to answer questions, but it's a privilege to be here and to have had the experience I had. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Gary, and thank you, Kelly. That was tremendous. If we were just able to walk out of here having heard the presentation we've just heard, we wouldn't have done too badly, but there is time for some questions. A good MC always has a few at hand, but we are going to wrap up on time, and I don't want to get in the way of anybody in the room, and there are a lot of people, such as Larry Herman. If I don't call on you by name, it's because of the bright lights. I was speaking to Larry earlier. He has a microphone, but put a hand up and I'll get to you even if I have to use the index finger. Larry, over to you. Thank you.
I thought the presentations were superb. Ambassador Kraft gave a pretty hard-hitting, blunt message, and it resonates. But I want to ask you about the review process. We won't go into the details of what's in the treaty, but there is a possibility that the review, which begins in 2026, could continue for 10 years. It could be a rolling review without closure. And the problem is, or the challenge is, how the three governments, and how Canada and the United States can manage the process of the review so that there isn't uncertainty year after year for the business community. And that's the danger in this whole review process. It has to be orchestrated and managed by all three governments to avoid this ongoing uncertainty as negotiations continue without closure. So I wonder what the three ambassadors might have to say about this issue of stability, certainty, all of which are very important to the private sector in both countries, in all three countries, in fact.
Larry, thank you. I believe, Kelly, if you'd like to go first, that's to you.
Do I have this on?
Yes, it should work.
Okay.
Just
So I think what's important to know is that this was President Trump's signature trade deal, the largest in the history of America. It is a template for the rest of the world. The review mechanism, the first of its kind, yes, we have 34, 35 chapters of NAFTA. But what's important is that we have a dispute mechanism before we get to the review, so that we are working out issues just as the US and Canada are working out energy issues with Mexico. And the fact that the US is working out issues with Mexico and Canada on the labor value content, on the autos.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand that we are already working on the dispute mechanisms, the arbitration. Therefore, that leads us into the review. So this has started, what, David, maybe a year and a half ago? Yeah. So that we are teeing this up to make certain that it is not failure. And it is so important, especially now with the state of the world, that this trade agreement does not fail. I firmly believe it will not fail. I feel pretty good about the new president, Claudia. I think that she will continue that administration, so we're not going to see any surprises. I think that's a positive. This is President Trump's signature, and we worked really hard at making this happen. And I just can't see, if we go through the review process correctly, and we've already had our dispute mechanisms, and that's important. And the other issue that's really important, because we've had these looming elections, Mexico just had theirs, the US is having ours, Canada will have theirs. It is more important than ever that the private-public partnerships are part of our everyday trade, and that you hold our elected officials accountable, because it's the Senate that's going to be making most of the decisions, and the House. But it's up to all of you in this room to continue the work while we are all wondering about our elections and how the incoming administration will handle USMCA.
Thank you. Yeah, David,
the only thing I, just would add, and that is that, early on, and even when the Mexicans and the Americans agreed to a deal that we weren't part of, and we eventually, renegotiated some of the points that the Mexicans had agreed to, there were two things that we just absolutely were not going to sign on to. One was a sunset clause, which wasn't a review process. It was, okay, it ends after 5 years unless everybody agrees to renew it. And it was just like, it was called a sunset clause. And the other one was, in the original thing with the Mexicans, there wasn't a dispute resolution mechanism. And so having both those in, there's always the possibility that it's a rolling negotiation or whatever. But the fact of the matter is that review mechanism is a significant improvement over what either existed or what was proposed. And part of the reason why we agreed to the review wasn't just so that we could end up with tough negotiations every several years. It was that, there were parts of the NAFTA agreement that were agreed to in 1993 that you couldn't anticipate were going to be, technology had changed. We hadn't really hadn't contemplated that, and there was no mechanism to include those changes into the deal. There was no amendment mechanism. And given the way the world is going and the way technology is going and everything else, having the ability to fine tune this without it becoming a brouhaha and a termination clause, I think is a valuable thing. I think we have to go through this 2025, 26 thing. And I think that will create an awful lot of, stability and the business community will feel a lot better when we go through that and it doesn't blow up, because I don't think it's going to. I agree with Kelly.
Thanks very much, Gary.
Yeah, I certainly, I mentioned it before when I spoke, but I really believe, having been in Washington just about 3 weeks ago, there's a real strong consensus with Canada and the United States on this issue of state-owned enterprises undermining the spirit, the fundamental values of the trade agreement, Larry. So I think there's already the discussion starting 2 years out on what we can agree to. And Canada was solid on the issue of energy, the energy dispute the United States had with Mexico. We supported and sided with the United States, and I think that was a very good decision. And it creates that environment where a trusted trading partner.
Well, thank you. I didn't see a hand, but I want to make sure I didn't miss a bid. Yes. Addie, you're way ahead of me. Go ahead, please, John.
I have a question for Kelly Croft on this forthcoming renegotiation of CUSMA, or I should say USMCA. USMCA was negotiated by the Trump administration. It, I think, hopefully fulfilled most of the items that were on their wish list. Now, it comes up for a reconsideration, renegotiation, whatever, at the beginning of 2020, at least in July 2026. The U.S. Trade Representative, there's a big input coming from her. It's all set out in the CUSMA the USMCA implementing legislation. The question is, given that the USMCA was, in essence, a brainchild of the Trump administration, how do you think a Trump administration would deal with the reconsideration of this agreement? Would it be okay with them? Would they want little changes, or would they want a ton of changes?
That's a great question. I will tell you that, as David just stated, if you look at how much has changed so quickly in technology, we should be so thankful that we have this review in July the 1st of 2026, because we have the highest standards in our digital and our financial services and our regulatory. We need to now address, and David can attest to this, being with Palantir, we have got to address cybersecurity, artificial intelligence. We have, as the EU countries have done, we have got to put a gate. We've got to have guidelines. We have got to have safety net issues to protect North America in this, this time of AI and our cybersecurity. And I can tell you that it takes all three countries to keep their word. That's the success of an agreement. It takes all three countries to be in compliance. And listen, all three countries are not without fault. I mean, just as we talked about, Canada, US together on energy, Canada, Mexico now with auto. So the US is now going to be speaking about the digital services tax, which we didn't get to discuss. I think that's really important. But President Trump, that is one of his signatures. And it's also a signature of the Canadian government, of the Canadian business community, of governors, of everybody from your legislature to your mayors. We visited mayors, David. We visited everyone who had an interest in the economy, the security, the safety of North America. So I feel very strongly that this review is a must in order to bring in, as David said, what we have not anticipated, what's coming and what's continuing to change, and also for the better, for the safety and the security of our trade in our country, because it is a world of uncertainty at the moment.
Well, thank you. Thank you for mentioning the digital services tax, which might not be a much better basis for funding defense than capital gains taxes.
Oh, gosh.
It might never come in, but Gary or David, any comments on that? Or you feeling relatively good about it? I might just, we've got time for one more. I'm surprised.
Can I make just a comment that I wanted to say that my dear friend who is from Canada that lived in Toronto, closest friend that I made while I was in Canada as far as just a public person was Rex Murphy. And I just want to just give a tribute. Makes me. I spoke with Rex 10 days before his passing. And I said, Rex, I had not approached the death because we didn't talk about that. And so Rex, myself, and Jordan Peterson had this little trio going, and we always spoke every Sunday. And I said, Rex, what can I do to continue your legacy? And he has a friend in Vancouver that was his very first friend growing up, and they helped one another when they fell on hard times. He said, you just take care of Jerry. So is that not just typical Rex? But I have to say, Rex was going to the hospital. He passed away 2 days later. He knew why he was going to the hospital, and he checked his iPad to make certain that his latest op-ed on Israel was going to print. So here's to Rex. Right?
Indeed. All right. At least we got that one last column from him. Elise, please, over to you.
Thank you very much. Great to have you all here today. Quick question. You spoke about, obviously, your concerns around trade and what will be happening there. You also spoke about defense. I wondered what each of you think might be sort of another major point of contention in this world that's on fire, as we said earlier. If, as you mentioned, Ambassador Kraft, we move towards a Trump administration, what do you think might be that outside of trade, outside of defense, another major point of contention between our two countries that we need to be thinking about and preparing for?
I mean, I think NATO it has to be front and center. And the reasoning, because as you know, with Ukraine, with Russia invading Ukraine, who's to say Ukraine is just a pathway for him to go further to the Baltic and then to the NATO countries. We have to be prepared, Canada and the US, for what is the unknown with Putin. I mean, you look at, who would have ever thought when you talk about a war, you say, well, which war, right? We need to be thinking about China and Taiwan. And that's even more important that Canada increases their own defense. This is only for Canada's good. And then for the good of the rest of North America and for the safety, the security, our national security. So I see our next biggest issue is going to be continuing NATO, also making certain that you all just increase your own defense spending and in your funding, because I can tell you China and Taiwan are next, and they are very concerned. When I travel, I've been traveling around the world speaking, I will go and speak on a certain topic and nobody wants to hear that. All they want to know is Trump, Trump, Trump. And so they're very concerned is what is going to happen with defense. Japan has been so concerned about the defense and watching NATO and how some countries are not paying their 2%, that they will become the third largest defense budget in their area. That's huge. And they're not even part of NATO. I mean, they recognize the Indo-Pacific, and we need to all, I think that's going to be the next big thing, is the Indo-Pacific. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. I'll ask, Gary?
Well, I think, first of all, I want to make the point that Canada has always had a sovereign policy on our own defense and defense spending and decisions we make on international issues. I mentioned a couple examples when we were together with the U.S. when I was in Washington. I would mention one where it was more difficult. We did not agree or did not participate in the Iranian nuclear discussions. And partly, one of the realities in Washington that you really see is, the narrative is Israel against everybody else in the Middle East. But quite frankly, Israel was very much aligned with the Sunni countries on that issue, UAE, Saudi Arabia, a number of other countries in the region. And so we did not, I mentioned Afghanistan, I mentioned Libya, other ISIS, we were sending military to, but we don't agree to everything. So you can have a sovereign military policy and still have your level of contribution that you have already signed on the dotted line for. And I think Canadians, people argue, well, military spending is not that popular in a budget. Well, I actually do believe the sovereignty of the Arctic and not sending a plane from Minot, North Dakota, but rather from Cold Lake, Alberta, is a Canadian value. And it's always been a Canadian value. We're celebrating D-Day this week. And we've always shown up. And we got to show up on the 2%, but we have to do it in a way that also makes sense for our sovereignty, the Arctic. When I was in Washington, it surprised me to see some Chinese diplomats meeting with Icelandic diplomats talking going to all the Arctic Council meetings. When there was a meeting, they were attending it as quote an observer. I don't believe they were coming there as an observer. Maybe I'm very cynical, but I don't think they were there as an observer. They had pretty long-term ambitions.
Maybe they're researching viruses.
In the security, speaking of China and the Arctic, in the Security Council, Russia used to be, the decision maker for China. So now they're on equal playing field, and that's scary. And they are in the Arctic. They're not just attending those meetings, they're gathering information because they are spending money on their nuclear submarines. They're spending money. They understand the importance of the Arctic and the region. So you're exactly right, Gary.
Yes. The only, I'd just add, there are, quite apart from, and I agree with everything that's been said, but there are some other issues that, we need to collaborate much closer with the Americans. Somebody mentioned cybersecurity. The reality is that if tensions increase or, something happens and Russia decides that they're going to invade another country, whatever, you can bet that there'll be an attack on our basic infrastructure, whether that be, the grid or whatever. And those things, we have a North American electricity grid, and we need to figure out how we're going to make sure, because what they'll do is they'll find the weakest link in all of that. And then we've got, you get outside of Washington and out into some of the smaller towns across the United States, and you have, deaths from fentanyl. The whole drug issue is a huge issue in both the United States and in Canada, and another area where, we have the ability to collaborate. And then, these, whether it be wildfires, whether it be anything else, we need to have emergency measures collaboration much more, much closer than we have at the present moment. So I think that there are so many things that we can, do that is mutually beneficial to our two countries and solidify that partnership that we should be really zeroing in and focusing on.
Well, this has been a tremendously wide-ranging discussion, and it is quite painful for me to do my duty, which is to make sure that we close up on time. I expect, and if the ambassadors are willing to make themselves available, that there is going to be a lot of conversation after we close formally, but for those who have airplanes to catch or other urgent appointments, we do need to wrap up. I mentioned at the beginning that J&J is the co-sponsor of today's session. We're delighted to have James Brody, who is an executive with J&J. He is the general manager of MedTech. And with no further ado, James, I'll just invite you to come up, please. And you have the light duty of thanking the three ambassadors for an extraordinarily rich, wide-ranging, at times depressing, but in some respects quite encouraging discussion. So over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And I think I speak on behalf of Dominic as well when I say that the richness of the conversation, the richness of the panel makes it very easy for the companies that we represent to support events like this. So I don't think I could do a thank you justice other than to say you've certainly stimulated a lot of thinking, as you said, with a wide range of topics. And I think people are as interested in the subsequent conversation if you're able to stick around as well. So thank you very much. It's been a stimulating conversation. And on a lighter note, some people in my organization had a bit of an over-under on a couple of topics that would be quite lateral to the topic at hand. One was the Bank of Canada rate, and whether that would come up tonight, and the other was capital gains. So we're 50-50 on the over-under, because Mr. Doer and Bill brought up the capital gains, so that's fantastic. Listen, as one of the world's largest and most broadly based life sciences companies, it's probably not surprising that I'll stick in my lane a little bit and maybe frame some of of my closing comments around life sciences sector that was mentioned just a little bit briefly towards the end here. And I want to start more with anecdote. When I attend events like this, or even cocktail parties, or everywhere in between, the topic of health inevitably comes up through personal discussion, personal conversation. It's either hockey, weather, or health in Canada usually, which I'm sure, Kelly, you would agree with in your time here. But I think that, all of the stories that I hear, and I heard half a dozen stories tonight when I was mingling outside as well, all talked about personal, connections with delivery of healthcare, personal journeys, et cetera, whether it's biopharmaceuticals, whether it's med tech, digital health, as was mentioned previously before. And they're all extremely heartwarming stories about recovery and living life to the fullest. And the challenge that I find, particularly as someone who represents a broader industry of medtech anyway in Canada, is that too often these stories are left as anecdote. And not often enough have they bubbled up to the consciousness of public policy until, frankly, recently. And so recently, of course, the pandemic hit, no surprise to anybody in the room, and the life sciences sector as a whole was seen as a resurgent industry that was literally saving lives at a population level. So for the first time, we were seeing anecdote turn to population view, and we're now seeing many of the provinces, if not all, and certainly the feds, honing in on life sciences strategy. And so innovation in the biopharmaceutical sector, med tech, and digital health all being kind of cornerstones of that. And so really pleased, that, several of the provinces represented here. And I saw earlier tonight, Minister Fedeli over in the corner as well. I've seen you at several podiums, several press releases talking about this province's strategy around life sciences. And we really appreciate yours and your peers' support for life sciences sector. And I know colleagues of mine were at Bio in San Diego, and we've got a massive global medtech conference coming to Toronto as well for the first time in October. So we'll see more of that. And so we're really pleased to see that the conversation is moving not just to an area of managing cost or managing budget, to see life science sector as an industry that, yes, of course, navigates the complexities of changing health for humanity, but also is a very a strong contributor to the economy at large. And it was stated at the very end by Mr. MacNaughton, has the promise of supporting security as well. I certainly hope there isn't another crisis, the kind of which we saw from 2020 through to 2023 and are still navigating. But most of the epidemiologists and virologists would suggest that or another crisis is around the corner. So making sure that we step up our focus on the sector, make sure that we integrate these into conversations like with CUSMA is going to be important, again, not just for health reasons, for the economy and for the security of both of our countries as well. So thank you. We're very pleased to be part of tonight's event, and we'll continue to be a strong supporter of CD Howe Institute.
Thank you. I have one more thing to say. All this talk about health reminded me there may be some younger people in the room who would wonder why health would be among the 3 top topics. Well, just wait. But I do want to say among the CD Howe Institute's board members, we have 3. Scott Burns from Burnco, Louis Gagnon from Intact Financial Corporation, and Stephen Smith from First National, who have sponsored student tables. If you are a student at one of these tables, please put your hand up. Welcome. Please stick around. And learn the pleasures of talking about health, as James was just describing to us. We need to close. If you're interested in other CD Howe Institute events, please visit our website. We've got some doozies coming up, including our Regent debate with the proposition that Canada can turn a Trump presidency from a threat into an opportunity. And I think we've just heard some great arguments about why that might be a logical proposition to debate. Please join me again in thanking our sponsors. Bennett Jones, Dom, thank you for your opening remarks. J&J, James, thank you for your closing remarks. And of course, to Kelly Graft and Gary Doer and David MacNaughton, great presentations, great evening.